Good morning. I have known our next speaker for more than 15 years, back when we were both straight. And, J.J. Jones is a farm kid from rural Kansas. He now lives in the city, but he has never been able to escape his agricultural roots. J.J. is the consummate foodie. If you look up foodie in the dictionary, JJ's picture is right next to it. JJ travels around the country checking out good food, teaching people about agriculture, and really helping people understand where their food comes from. JJ lives with his husband in Kansas City, where they are entertainers. They bring people over for food and wine and conversation. And JJ's most recent project is convincing Kevin that they need to expand their family by adding a corgi. I am thrilled to welcome a friend and part of this family to deliver our keynote this morning. Please help me welcome Mr. J.J. Jones.
Well, good morning, everyone. Well, that's a little better than I thought it might be after some of the festivities we've all been enjoying. And as Kirk mentioned, I do get to travel quite a bit and share the food and agricultural story. And there's a couple things that came to mind as I was preparing for my time with you this morning. First of all, I'm deeply honored and humbled that the Cultivating Change and Cultivating Change Foundation board and staff invited me to share a few comments with you, because as I have known some people for a number of years before we all began this journey together, and then as I've gotten to know some of you through social media and in other activities and events where we've met, there's a tremendous amount of talent in this room and in this group of individuals that we call our family, who are LGBT folks within the food and agricultural space. So it is humbling and an honor to share a few thoughts, at least based on my perspectives. I would also say I get to speak on a lot of different stages. This is probably the best decorated stage that I've ever spoken on. So I'm going to have a new requirement in my speaking contract of what goes on the stage where I speak. But anyway, so we'll go on that. I do have a favor to ask of some of you. Stereotypically, I've found that gay men operate best after brunch. It's a little bit before brunch. So if you are an LBT or ally, you might need to poke the person next to you every so often because they haven't had a Bellini or a mimosa yet. So my story's not much different than many of the stories we've heard and we've shared and we've talked about throughout our time together. But I would like to share a little bit more about myself and my own story, and then use that to parlay into some observations that I've made over the years of accepting who I am and truly becoming someone who wanted to be not only authentic with my closest friends and family, but authentic with every person that I interacted with in a professional and a personal way. As Kirk mentioned, I grew up on a farm in western Kansas. My family has been there since the Homestead Act, raising wheat and cattle and hay. My father also was a small business owner. He went to the university and has a degree in business and computer science. My mother is a chemistry and physics teacher who has a degree in microbiology, psychology, gifted education, and God knows what else she's working on right now. But I say all that because I'm a very logical person. Logic rules my life. It rules the way my family and I think. We think in terms of numbers and graphs and science and data. So all of a sudden, when I was growing up and I started to sense that there was something different about me than the rest of the community I was growing up in, it was difficult because I didn't have someone I could go to and figure out logically why I was different than the environment I was around. Because like many of you in a small county, it was 30 miles by 30 miles. There were 1,500 of us. I think the math is basically one person per 6 square miles. I knew of 3 people who folks suspected were gay. Nobody ever said anything nasty or bad about them. They just said, well, they have a friend, or they're a confirmed bachelor, or, they just had nice kind of ways of saying, well, they're different and we love them, but, they didn't really inspire you to want to be like them. And so, obviously, growing up, I thought, well, okay, I'll figure this out. Logically, something's going to kick in. There's some hormone that I'm deficient in that's just going to click, and poof, we're good to go, yada, yada, yada. Well, that never really happened. And so I was very fortunate to be successful in my high school and collegiate career and on into my early professional career. And it was about 2004, 2005, after graduating, that I thought, well, there's something missing. I do need to be a little more authentic in who I am. And at first I thought, well, maybe if I just accept it myself, but as the intro video has shared, I knew, well, if I'm authentic to who I am with myself, there's no way I can be authentic within the food and agricultural space because it's a conservative space. There's not a place for me as an LGBT community member in food and agriculture. But I'm career-oriented, so I'm going to focus on my career. I'll find other avenues to take up my time so that I don't give in to something that I didn't want to give into, if you will. So I took up marathon running. You know, I would run 35 or 40 miles a week, and I would get involved in community activities and just try to fill every waking hour with something so that by the time I got home at night, I was so tired I just fell asleep and, get up and do it the next day, and we'll go on about life. Well, there's a wonderful book that I read a number of years ago called The Tipping Point. That, in every organization or every situation, there's kind of a tipping point where you change your thoughts and your minds. My tipping point for accepting who I was, not only to myself, but also to the greater community that I was living in, was when a good friend of mine from church who had accepted who he was at a younger age, he's quite a bit younger than I am. In high school, he'd already come out, if you will, to his family and his friends, and he was our church organist. Phenomenally talented individual. I've never seen anyone who could look at a sheet of music, within 30 seconds have the entire piece memorized, and play it without ever looking at the music again. Was active in his high school, was a great mentor to younger people, and was just a phenomenal individual that I really appreciated his skills and talents. And I grew up in a church that was and still go to a church that's very open and accepting on a lot of avenues and realms. But all of a sudden, when my friend who was the church organist met someone in college, and after a while of dating, they decided that they wanted to have a commitment ceremony, they came to our church and asked if they could have a commitment ceremony. And the elders in the church and the board turned him down. Yet this was a church that had said everybody is welcome. They talked about how they weren't going to judge people. And that really bothered me because here was somebody that we all knew. And it wasn't like he just woke up one morning and decided to do this. This was something that he had thought about and he really wanted to do. And what bothered me more was the way the decision was made. It was just kind of a quick decision. They really didn't have a lot of conversations with anybody. And so, as I thought more about it, I thought, you know what? This is a church that also has asked me to be in leadership positions. I chaired the stewardship committee. I helped with a capital campaign to renovate the church. I sang in the church choir. I belonged to a small group, volunteered to do different outreach activities. And I thought the only difference is they'll accept me because they don't know who I authentically am, but they won't accept Joe when he's authentic and has been up front since day one. So I do what I do best. I got on my computer and I write letters. I can write a very strongly worded letter. So I wrote him a letter because I thought, this is just the way I'm going to do it, and they may rip it up and tear it up, or they may actually read it. And I was pleasantly surprised that the board and the elders actually did read my letter. And the way I closed the letter was two things. One, I talked about the fact that, for me anyway, if there's any organizations in the United States that should be accepting and open of marginalized individuals, it's the church. At least in the Christian religion, the individual we follow accepted marginalized individuals day in and day out. And I've never read a story where he actually required them to significantly change a whole lot other than if they really were not showing compassion or respect or love. But that's what our church was doing. It was all of a sudden they were saying, well, wait a second, no, you're marginalized, we don't need you. Second thing I closed in the letter with was, by the way, I hope you know that the person who's just been raising money through your stewardship committee, helped you with your capital campaign, serves on your board, and sings in your church choir is also gay. was tickled to death, that's a saying we use, I guess, tickled pink, whatever, when the elders and the board decided to reconsider and actually follow a process that our denomination believes in, where they brought in individuals with differing viewpoints to sit down for a conversation. So instead of several individuals who all identified as heterosexual, who all thought alike, making a decision that affected the masses of the body of the church, they actually brought in individuals like myself and others from the LGBTQ community to discuss and think about what the church's role should be. Joe ended up getting married in the church, so I was pleased that we had come that far. But then it dawned on me. I just told my church I'm gay, but nobody else really knows, including my family or anybody else. Hadn't thought that far ahead this time, so that was going to be an interesting situation. So I did what I do best again. I decided a letter would work. So, and I joke about that, but there was a very purposeful reason I chose to come out to my family, my parents in particular, through a letter. I make my living by watching people and figuring out their reactions and their feelings and their thoughts. And I grew up with a mother who, as my godfather affectionately called, a blankety-blank women's libber. He did affectionately call her that. But my mother had fought for women's rights. And it wasn't that my father wasn't open-minded, but he was a traditional Western Kansas farmer and rancher. He was very conservative in a lot of his views. And there were things that at times he had said, I can distinctly remember at times watching Will and Grace, which was the only outlet to an LGBT situation I had growing up, that he would make comments that I thought, well, that's not going to sit well with Larry Lee. And so I decided to write them a letter because I wanted them to be able to privately process this news and come to terms with it, and then we could have a discussion. Because I knew in my heart that if I saw any inkling of disappointment or doubt or anything like that, there was no way that I could ever get past that to go on with the rest of life. But I also thought, well, I needed to build kind of a support team around me. So I identified 4 individuals in my life that I knew no matter what, they would be with me. And so if, for some reason, and that was a big if I knew, but if my parents couldn't accept who I was, that I had a network to go to. And so I called each of those individuals, explained who I was authentically, what I was getting ready to do, and why I needed their help. Luckily, all 4 of them said, yes, we will help you. And one of those individuals was my brother. And, my brother's younger than I am, but we're only 20 months difference in age. He is the quintessential, he's my father reincarnated. From the time he was about 6, he rode bulls. When he was too tall to ride bulls, he rode saddle broncs. He went to the Marines. He shoes horses. The funny story about my brother in the Marines is when he shipped off to basic training, my parents and I were told that he wouldn't be able to call home for about 6 weeks. Well, 2 weeks in, the phone rings, and it's my brother. And this is what my mother's telling me. He quickly and succinctly said, I have 2 minutes, I can't tell you much, but here, I'm doing fine, blah, blah. And he just went on with a rattling of things. He said, I'll explain later why I have this call. Okay, so we fast forward to the 6-week mark. The reason Jeff had a call home at 2 weeks was they were doing the pummel sticks on a high beam. Jeff received a 2-minute award phone call for knocking a guy off and breaking his nose. He's kind of a tough little devil. So I was glad that Jeff was in my corner, and he went home and was willing to be there when Mom and Dad received the news, so that if they needed help processing it, they had that assistance or that support. And fortunately for me, all of my fears were unfounded. Mom was happy she had another cause to bring into life. Dad quickly, he was baffled of why wouldn't he accept it? This was one of his sons, and then I began the process from there. And one of the questions that Marcus provided in kind of the guiding question document to you all and to myself prior to the summit was, when was it that you decided that you could be authentically yourself and still part of rural America or agriculture? And that was really the beginning of a process. And I think what I've heard throughout the stories during our time is that for all of us, it wasn't maybe a specific moment, but it was a series of moments, or it was an evolution of how we could be authentic to ourselves and to the communities and the industries that we all love so much. And so again, I share this with you because I'm a logical person, so I tried to address all of this through logic and reason. But now as I reflect back on it, it really ties in with some of the work I do right now for, as Kirk mentioned, the food system and how do we earn consumer trust in food. And our models are built off a lot of sociology and psychology and anthropological models, because as much as we like to think we as human beings are rational decision makers in everything we do, we're not. We're highly emotional. We make a lot of decisions based off feelings and gut and emotion and values, and we've talked about some of those values during this summit. But what I do with the food system is how do we work with farmers and ranchers, with food companies, processors, no matter their production practice, their processing practices, whatever those might be, how do we ensure that they have a freedom to operate as a business? And what we found is that trust is what allows you a freedom to operate. Well, the models are built in such a way that we can actually apply that to our own selves, that all we want is a freedom to be authentically ourselves. That's really, in my opinion, what Pride Month is about, what Pride was established for, and really what Cultivating Change was established for, is how can we be freely the individuals that we are, and how do we have that freedom to be ourselves? And so it goes back to, it's a trust issue. And it's not that any of us have done anything to cause mistrust with individuals or organizations that we may encounter. It's just a natural reaction that we as humans have to someone or something that's a little different than us. And the reason trust is so key is we did the research, there's 3 things that make up why we trust someone or an organization. The first thing is we trust someone or an organization because someone who's influential in our lives has shared with us why we should trust that individual. And we've talked about the fact that some of the advancements for the LGBTQ community have been because more people know someone who identifies or is authentically lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer. And so there's more and more influential folks in life today who can help earn that trust within the LGBTQ community. The other thing is people look for competency, technical skills. They look for the logic and the reason around why someone is the way they are, or why an organization is the way it is. And a lot of times in food and agriculture, especially those of us who've grown up in agriculture and went on to study agriculture, we're very scientifically and logically minded people. Kind of like myself. We tend to look at things through logic and reason. But then the third reason you trust an individual or an organization is because of a value similarity. That individual or organization shares similar values to you. In food and agriculture, a lot of times, because we're so logical and we base a lot of decisions we think on reason, we think that it's about technical skills or competency. So I used to love to, when individuals would ask me questions about my sexuality, I would say, well, and Trent used this example the other night, it's the laws of physics. For every action, there is an opposite and equal reaction. So if there's heterosexual people, there's going to be homosexual people. It's just science, people. But that never really got very far with too many folks. I would try to impress them with statistics because I knew I was visiting with someone who cared about their economic benefit. And according to Dr. Armand Vincent Bordeaux at Kansas State University in the Ag Economics Department, gay men spend 70% more of their disposable income on food. Kevin and I are testament to that. But I thought that would show the agricultural and food community, no, we're a good customer. You want to like us. But it didn't always work. But then as I've done more and more work with different food system organizations and began studying our research into trust, it dawned on me that it's really the value similarity. And what we found through our research are that shared values are 3 to 5 times more important in earning trust than demonstrating your technical skills or competency alone. And again, the way the models are built, I would propose that it's the same if we're going to earn a freedom to be who we are. it's so vital that we feel comfortable in being authentic to ourselves, because it's when we share our stories and when we share our values that people begin to trust us as individuals, that we have the same passions that they do about food and agriculture. We have the same emotions and feelings about our friends and our family and our communities. And it can be difficult to, trust me, I know, to stand up and talk about values and who you are authentically. There was a movie in 2003 called What a Girl Wants, where she travels to the UK and she meets her biological father. And while there, she also meets her paternal grandmother, and she goes up to give her paternal grandmother a large hug, and the woman says, "No, dear, I'm English. We only show affection to dogs and horses." Well, that's kind of me. So we have to think about how can we be vulnerable and share our values. So like every good 4-H talk, there's 3 points of how we can authentically share our values of who we are and who we are authentically. The first is we need to begin to listen more to one another, but also those who have questions about who we are. For many of us who grew up in rural communities, there may be individuals that we encounter in our family or our network of friends that we may be the first openly LGBTQ person that they've met. And there's going to be a lot of questions going through their mind. And I'm not saying that the way I came out or presented myself to people or identified authentically who I was is the only way or the best way, but as I reflect on it, one of the things I shared with a close group of friends that I called after I began coming out, if you will, because I'd made a list, I like lists, I'd made a list of all the people in my life that I wanted them to hear it from me. That they should not hear it from anybody else, they shouldn't read about it on Facebook or hear it through the rumor mill when they're paying their water bill, whatever. So there was, this first sphere of friends beyond those 4 that I talked about earlier. But one of the things I shared with every one of those individuals is I'm willing to answer any question you have as long as you're willing to answer the same question. That was my rule to promote civility. Because sometimes people, they may have questions that they really want to ask you, but quite frankly, it's none of their business. And if I asked them the same question, I'd be slapped or they'd be offended. So that was the only rule. But it really allowed me to, better understand where they were coming from. What were their concerns? And so then we could have this listening moment where I was listening to them, and then I could ask follow-up questions. The best follow-up question I ever had, it was after listening, and one of my good friends, he said, I'm really struggling with this. You're shifting my paradigm of thought, and I'm thinking about it. And he was still of the belief that sexual orientation is a choice. Now, that's bull malarkey. It's not a choice. And he said, because one, if I made a choice, he had to make a choice at some point. So I said, if you can even give me the year you made your choice, I'll gladly give you the year, date, and month that I made my choice. But, couldn't get there. But then he also, wanted to make sure that I had explored all my options. You get where I'm going with this? And I said, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. I'll do that. And he was really excited for a second. So I said, you find me a female, I'll find you a male, and we'll explore together, and you tell me what happens. He's yet to call me with who he set me up with. But, I say that jokingly and humorously, but, again, through listening and asking and having a conversation, we identified the fact that we still had the same values and the same emotions. And I know sometimes it's easy to think, especially if we're in a marginalized or a minority community, that maybe our values are different than other communities we're part of. I would propose that actually our values aren't that much different. In fact, psychologists have studied to look at, are there universal values that transcend the globe? And there are. There's compassion, responsibility, respect, trust, and faithfulness. There's universal values. Now, the way we express those values may be different, but at the core of our being, of who we are, those values are very similar. And it's through listening and asking and then sharing our personal stories that we begin to figure out what the other person's values are, where our values are similar, and then how we can connect. Even though we may express our values differently, still those values are similar in there. I think about it too, why do individuals have the reaction they do to someone who's different than they are? And like I think someone was talking about the Ohio men's course. My partner was in the Kansas City, the Heartland men's course for a number of years. And I think, 6 or 7 years ago, they did a song where the premise of the song was that, hate really is not ingrained in human beings, that it's something that's taught. And usually hate is taught and expressed because of a fear or something that's happened in someone's life. And, as I mentioned, being willing to listen and ask and share personal stories in my own situation and life experiences, my father and I had the ability to do that same thing. As I mentioned, growing up, every so often, just comments that my father would make weren't exactly comments that showed he could approve of a lifestyle that was different than his. And so then he shared with me why that was, because actually as a youth, a traumatic event had happened to him on my grandfather's farm by a hired hand on the farm. And in my father's world, he associated the evil that person did with homosexuality. So he went through a large portion of his life with that correlation, and that's why he had a fear of individuals who might be different than him. But fortunately for me, just the fact that his love for my brother and myself and his family, it trumped his personal or earlier experiences. And through the listening and asking and sharing concept, he was able to accept me for who I authentically am, and we had a strong relationship from day one of when I became authentic to him and the others. There's some individuals, though, that it's going to take them a while. Marcus talked about his favorite class with Dr. Jackman was statistics. Well, I had a statistics professor that said everybody's on a bell-shaped curve. You can map everybody and anything on a bell-shaped curve. And, if we're at one end of the bell-shaped curve, you have those that really are dug in about their viewpoints about LGBTQ issues at the other end. Really, the folks we're trying to reach are the ones that have those authentic questions in the middle, which are the majority of individuals, at least that I've encountered, and I hope it's the same for you. But what I found, too, in listening and asking and sharing with individuals is there are some individuals, it's going to take them a while. I have one aunt in particular, because of her faith beliefs, she really struggles. She wants to like Kevin so much she can't see straight, but she really struggles. And the reason is because they have a value similarity. The way they show love for other people is through food. Kevin's one heck of a pie baker. And my aunt loves Kevin's pies. And so when we're at a family event, for a brief moment, every time she bites into a piece of pie, she thinks, I really love Kevin. And then she remembers what he did to her nephew, and she has to, fight off the urge to really love him. But little by little, every holiday and family gathering, we're getting there. And I doubt she's ever going to volunteer to cater a gay wedding, or she's ever going to volunteer to be a spiritual counselor to a lesbian couple or anything like that. But she is getting there in her love for people who are different than her. And so as I engage with my aunt or other individuals that still have this fear and this unwillingness to trust someone that's a little different than them, I just have to think something has happened somewhere in their life that has caused them to have this fear of people who are different than they are. And so I'll just show them empathy. And we'll see if we can move over time. But I'm not going to focus a lot of energy on those folks because there's a lot more in the bell-shaped curve that we can really focus on. The final thing I would share with you is in terms of kind of where I see the Cultivating Change Foundation and all of us playing such a significant role as leaders within food and agriculture and leaders within the community or the family that we're part of. The CEO of my organization gives a lot of presentations to farmer and rancher groups, and one of the things he likes to say about farmer and rancher groups is we have an old white guy problem, just in terms of leadership and kind of the thought process. And really, if you look over the last couple decades, not only food and agriculture, but a lot of industries have changed. Just the American face has changed in terms of who is leading organizations. It used to be that it was white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males. But today we see more diversity than ever. We still have a ways to go, but we're seeing more and more diversity of all types in various organizations. But one of the challenges that we have is how do we engage in some of those difficult conversations with individuals about who we authentically are and why we still have a passion for food and agriculture and want to be part of this. And so I hope that one of the things that Cultivating Change can do is provide all of us with the tools, the motivation, the network to identify where are some of those difficult areas that we can go into. What are some of the difficult conversations that we can have with individuals that will begin to open the door into more inclusion and diversity within food and agriculture? And my hope is that if we each will take a leading role in those conversations, as Jason Clay of the World Wildlife Fund says about a lot of food and agricultural issues, we can begin discussing pertinent topics and not persistent topics. We really shouldn't care about someone's sexual orientation on the farm when we have 9 billion people to feed. We really shouldn't care about certain issues that always raise their ugly head when we have a limited amount of natural resources on our planet, even though we're using 2.5 planets worth of resources right now. There are a lot more pertinent issues that I would love to discuss in food and agriculture than who someone is. But in order to discuss those pertinent issues, we're going to have the meaningful conversation about diversity and inclusion. So I'd wrap it up again with, first and foremost, I would challenge us to remember that I would propose that our values as LGBTQ leaders within food and agriculture are actually very similar to the values of rural America still, that we all, not all, but many of us come from, are similar to the values of the food and agricultural industry. Our challenge is how do we have those meaningful conversations so that we can identify those common values and then begin to work together. And then I'd finally share, the wisdom of young children and adolescents is really powerful. And we talk about being a community or a family. And one of our dear friends, their son Grant, when he was about 11 years old, he defined for friends the difference between relatives and family. He said, relatives are who you're related to by DNA that you have to go see at Christmas. Family is who you choose to invite over after Christmas to have fun with. So I think that's what Cultivating Change can be for all of us and can be for other individuals in the LGBTQ community. And then finally, one of the questions that Marcus shared with us is, what's your biggest fear for LGBTQ individuals within the food and agricultural space? And this was a topic that I really had never thought too much about or hadn't been exposed to, quite frankly, until Kevin is a post-op recovery and critical care nurse and has his master's in healthcare administration. I say that he's the caring one. So he works for Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City, and in one of his roles, he serves on the Adolescent and Youth Suicide Prevention Council. And I had, again, thankfully, at least in my direct family and circle of friends, had not really been exposed to suicide, especially in young people. And Kevin came home one night, and it was the topic of our conversation for several nights, and then continues to be something we think about, and it translates into my fear for the LGBTQ community in food and agriculture. According to the Center for Disease Control, in 2015, 17% of youth and adolescents contemplated suicide. That's scary to think about. Almost 20% of young people have been in a situation in their life that they didn't feel like life was worth going on, and so they were contemplating ending it. But then according to the Trevor Project, LGB, not T, but LGB youth are 4 times more likely to contemplate suicide. And LGB youth who come from a non-supportive environment, so maybe a rural environment or an agricultural environment, are 8.5 times more likely to contemplate suicide. And then individuals who identify as transgender or who are going through a transgender process, the statistics are even more alarming. And so that, to me, again, is a challenge and an opportunity for the Cultivating Change Foundation, is how do we ensure that individuals within the LGBT community, especially young people, aren't part of the 4 times 17% or whatever the math would be. How do we make sure those individuals have a safe place? And so as we continue the conversations today, but more importantly, as we leave Sacramento and as we prepare to be in Des Moines next year and wherever else the year after, maybe Kansas City. I hear the barbecue's pretty good. I hope that we can continue to have these very pertinent conversations about how we include or increase inclusion and diversity in food and agriculture. And it's really not for people like me who, I'm authentic to myself, I'm open with others. It's the next generation of young people who are coming up and want to find their place in the food and agricultural community. So again, thank you for allowing me to be here and not only take part in the conversations, but share a few thoughts with you. And I hope that we'll continue to talk about our values as food and agricultural leaders, that we'll listen, ask, and share in engaging conversations with others who may not be like us or may have questions about the LGBT community. But then more importantly, how do we set the next generation up for success so they can have the same joys and successes that many of us have within food and agriculture in our rural communities? Thank you so much.
JJ, thank you for being authentically you, not only here, but in your communities of faith, food, and agriculture. Please help me thank JJ one more time.
Thank you.
So in a number of the stories that we've heard at the summit, there's been this recurring theme about people not having a role model to look to as they were growing up in rural America and in agriculture. And as I was listening to JJ and listening to Ben earlier this morning, I was thinking and was thrilled to think about the fact that the next generation of youth growing up in rural communities will have people like JJ, like Ben, like many people in this room to look to as role models, as examples of people who can live openly and authentically in their communities of faith, food, and agriculture. And I think that's a really exciting thing to be part of. We have two sets of workshops this morning. The first set, workshop session C in your program from 10 to 11. There'll be a 15-minute break. And workshop session D will be from 11:15 to 12:15. During the breaks, please check out the Engagement Center, which will be open until noon, and we will be back in here on the main stage at 1:30 for the rest of our program. So you've got about 5 minutes to get to the next workshop. Thank you for helping us kick off a great morning here at the Cultivating Change Summit.